Chapter 24, Section 1. So, after the Roman Empire fell apart, you're going to end up with various kings ruling different parts of this former empire. And many of them are going to come from these Germanic tribes that had invaded Europe. Charlemagne was the last great ruler that united Europe. But Charlemagne dies in the year 814. And when Charlemagne dies, the central government collapses. And you start to see Vikings begin to invade Western Europe from the north. And so you don't have this powerful king in charge anymore. You have these local lords that have the power. And we're going to enter a system called feudalism. Feudalism, this system had landowning nobles that would govern and protect the people in exchange for their service. They would fight for the noble's army. They would farm the noble's land. And in return, they wanted protection. The nobles were the rich. The nobles were the one controlling the shots now. And you also had clergy with some power as well. Clergy, these religious leaders, they also owned land and held power. They taught Christianity. They helped the poor, helped the sick. They would advise the nobles. And so the church is going to exert a lot of power in the Middle Ages. So what a lot of this is going to come down to is the fact if you owned land, you had power. Okay, the nobles owned land. The church, those religious leaders, they owned land. Charles Martel was the leader of the Franks. And what he's going to start to do is he's going to begin to give fiefs or estates to his loyal soldiers. He's rewarding them for their loyalty, rewarding them for their service. If you got a fief, that would give you income. Okay? You could then use that income to buy horses and weapons and armor. And the kings of Europe, after 800, are going to follow Martel's example. Owning land becomes tied to military service. You own land, you have more power, and you have more wealth. All of the kings after Charlemagne were weak. They couldn't rule their kingdoms very well. They ignored their responsibilities. They spent their time traveling. They depended on the nobles for everything. So the nobles had grown more powerful than any of these kings. So the nobles become these independent rulers of their area. They build their own armies. They start making their own money. And by 900, the nobles begin the job of protecting the people from the Vikings. They would build these hilltop fortresses and fence in the land. And peasants want protection as well. And so the peasants gave the nobles their land. It basically says, we'll work on it as long as we'll give you the land and we'll work on it as long as you protect us. So in reality, the peasants lost a lot of their freedom. By 1,000, thousands of feudal territories were spread across Europe. And they were the size of these, old Greek city states, except for there wasn't necessarily a central city. And the peasants had no say in the government. The noble that owned the land made up the laws for his area. There were more peasants and townspeople than there were nobles and clergy, but they don't have any rights. And most of the people believed that this is the way that God wanted it. So very few try to change anything. And whichever group you were in, that's the group you stayed in for life. The nobles are going to be made up of lords and vassals. Vassals served a lord of higher rank, gave him their loyalty. Okay, and in return, the vassal would get protection and a fief. All nobles, all nobles were the vassal of a king. The king might even be a vassal of another king. And as a vassal, you had to pay an act of homage. This was a ceremony officially tying the lord and the vassal together. And you promised service and loyalty to the Lord, and the Lord's going to give the vassal a fief. And the vassal is going to rule those on the fief. So he is in turn their Lord. The Lord gives protection. Basically, no protection, no loyalty. The vassal also had a number of duties they had to carry out. The vassal had to help the Lord in battle. So a lot of times the vassal would bring their own knights or warriors on horseback. And the vassal usually had to serve between 40 and 60 days a year for the Lord. The vassal would make payments to the Lord. Okay, if the Lord's daughter marries, you give him a gift. If the Lord's son becomes a knight, you give him a gift. The vassal also had things to do if the Lord was captured in battle. The vassal could either pay a ransom, or the vassal could go take his lord's place as prisoner, freeing the lord. Now the vassal's the prisoner. Another duty of the vassal was you had to attend the lord's court. And the vassals would provide the food and the entertainment. When a vassal died, the fief would go to the oldest son. And then the son would have to do an act of homage to the Lord, and show his desire for protection and servitude to the Lord.